In this Architecture Today webinar with programme partners Schu, Safety First, Designing Fire-Resistant Buildings. Coming up, presentations from Hydrock's Divisional Director, Fire Safety, Kevin McKeown, Head of Technical Development at Scott Brownrigg, Sarah Susman, and Andrea White, Fire Engineer at W Fire. In a moment, your chair, Ruth Slavid, but first, Schu UK's Commercial Director, Sean Butler.
Welcome to the latest in our series of 80 Schu webinars. In today's webinar, we will look at how we can embrace the principles that underpin the Building Safety Act and ensure we act effectively as an industry to deliver the new regulations. The government says that the Act will create a clear, proportionate framework for the design, construction and management of safer, high-quality homes in the years to come. So we will look today at how the strengthened regulatory oversight is shaping up and the work building designers and the wider construction industry itself need to undertake in order to deliver long-term improvements with regards to building safety. We have three expert speakers who will describe some of the many changes that will be required, from fire risk appraisals, new design parameters and incorporation of the golden thread. Schu is fully committed to providing effective applications and solutions for safe buildings and have developed numerous fire-resistant products and systems for the market and will continue to match and exceed any statutory requirements. Today's presentations and discussions will raise many crucial questions for everyone in the industry. Thank you once again for joining us. I'll now pass you to Ruth, who's chairing today's event.
Thank you, Sean. I think we all know how important this is. After the tragedy of Grenfell, everybody said something has to change. And now we are learning how it's changing, and we're going to have to come to terms with a real cultural change. And that is what our speakers today are going to help us to understand. They're going to be great speakers. They're explaining as much as they can in the short time available. But I think you will all have questions. So please do send those questions in using the question button, and we will take as many of them as possible, either after the presentations or at the end. So do send them in, and I'm now delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Kevin McKeown, who is Divisional Director of Fire Safety at Hydrock. Kevin.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Welcome to my presentation on the new approvals process for high-risk buildings. The Building Safety Act will, as everyone knows, comprise of the biggest change to fire safety regulation in a generation. But it will also introduce a paradigm shift in structural and fire safety culture. I'd like to begin by letting you know what we'll be talking about in this very short presentation. First of all, I'd like to provide a short introduction to the presentation, provide details on how you can get involved in the current consultations surrounding Part 3 and Part 4 of the Act. I'd then like to provide some background to the new Building Safety Act and the genesis of the new approvals regime for high-risk buildings. We will then discuss the role of the Building Safety Regulator and its proposed powers. And finally, I'd like to provide an outline of the new gateway process, the philosophy behind it, and how it's proposed to work. So if I could just, by means of an introduction, first of all, what is a high-risk building? Well, at the moment, the Health and Safety Executive has defined a high-risk building as a residential building with 7 or more stories. That is 18 metres in height, measured from fire service access level to the highest occupied floor. And the residential building needs to have at least 2 units. Hospitals and care homes are also deemed as high risk. Now, this could change. Part of the new consultations that we will be discussing, there's still a lot of secondary regulation up for grabs, if you'd like. So there's still some discussion as to what a high-risk building would be. So, for example, if there was a lot of fire incidents seen in low-rise blocks, then the building safety regulator could bring them into the high-risk bracket and category. Now, as I previously stated, there are currently several consultations underway, and I just wanted to bring those to your attention. And hopefully this might help you get involved in the discussion. First of all, there's a consultation in Part 3 of the Building Safety Act, and this is regarding the new building control regime, which we'll be talking about this morning. So we're looking at wider changes to the building regulations for all buildings, not just high risk. That consultation closes on the 12th of October. The other consultation is for occupied higher risk buildings. So you can have your say on how occupied buildings are managed. And that closes on the 12th of October also. And finally, there's a consultation underway about the fees and charges that will be offered from the Building Safety Regulator's office. So, as I said, I would encourage everyone to get involved. It's quite a significant consultation, and I'm pretty sure the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities would like to hear from you. So moving on, a bit of background regarding the new Building Safety Act and the proposed changes. So the new regulatory regime is a direct consequence of the Grenfell Tower fire tragedy, which obviously occurred on the 14th of June 2017, and it resulted, unfortunately, in the deaths of 72 of the building's residents. Subsequently, an independent review of building regulations and fire safety was conducted by Dame Judith Hackett. The review concluded that current regulations were not fit for purpose. Based on our recommendations, a new building safety bill was introduced in June 2021, and following its passage through the Houses of Parliament, the bill received royal assent in April of this year. The new Act will amount to the most significant reform of building safety, as is previously stated, structural and fire safety in a generation. And this will include the Building Safety Regulator, the Office of the Building Safety Regulator, which will be housed as part of the Health and Safety Executive. A new approvals process for high-risk buildings, which is the gateways. A proportionate safety case regime is also being adopted for high-risk buildings, and the digital golden thread of building information, which relates to the structural and fire safety, being maintained throughout the building life cycle, and that is from design to demolition. So this morning we'll be talking about the Building Safety Regulator and its powers and the gateway process. So some words on the Building Safety Regulator, but first I would like to give you a timeline from when the Building Safety Act was proposed in July 2021. As previously stated, the bill became law in April of this year. And 12 months following on from royal assent may see a secondary regulation with respect to a full review of the Regulatory Reform Order 2005 for fire safety. It will see the establishment of a residents panel to allow residents access to critical information and a voice on how buildings are maintained and managed. There will also be a review of the Architects Registration Board, and this is to look at, the competency levels in relation to both structural and fire safety. And then 12 months on, we should see the Office for Product Safety and Standards taking responsibility for national regulation on construction products. The OPSS will appoint a national regulator for construction products, and that will become fully operational once the Building Safety Act and its secondary legislation has been approved by Parliament. The purpose of the new regulations is obviously to restore public confidence in the manufacture and use of construction materials on residential and public buildings. 18 months following on from Royal Assent will see the implementation of most of the secondary regulation with respect to, as we spoke before, the Building Safety Regulator. The Building Safety Regulator will be responsible for overseeing residence panels. He'll also oversee the Industry Competency Committee and a Building Advisory Committee. There'll also be new duties for the accountable person. We'll see the introduction of approval gateways 2 and 3, which we'll discuss in more detail later in the presentation. And the digital golden thread will come into play also. So what powers does the Building Safety Regulator actually have? Well, in law, the main objectives of the Building Safety Regulator under Section 3.1 of the Building Safety Act is securing the safety of people in or about buildings in relation to risks arising from buildings and improving the overall standards of the buildings that we construct. So it'll have three main functions. Firstly, to oversee and help improve the safety within and standards of all buildings. So that's not just high-risk buildings, that's all buildings. It'll encourage all participants in the built environment industry to improve their competence. This might rely on the recommendations outlined in the BS 8670 standard, which we'll not go into detail on today. And it'll be implementing and managing the new approvals process for high-risk buildings, and that's namely the gateway process. So let's discuss the new gateway system. So there'll be three main gateways. Gateway 1 relates to planning. Gateway 2 will be a hard stop, which is what's about to become old money, Rebus Stage 4. So at Rebus Stage 4, you'll be required to go through a hard stop at Gateway 2, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the following slides. And then Gateway 3 is the final approval process, and you will have to have approval from the Building Safety Regulator to have your building occupied. But once again, we'll discuss that in greater detail in following slides. Okay, I would like to first of all take you through Gateway 1. So Gateway 1 is known as the Planning Gateway, and it was introduced in the 1st of August 2021 last year via secondary legislation. It's important to state that Gateway 1 doesn't form part of the Building Safety Act. However, applicants will need to submit a fire statement to the planning authority, demonstrating that they have considered fire safety issues in relation to things like land use, the general layout of the land, water supply, and access for the fire and safety, the fire and rescue services. The fire safety aspects of these planning applications are generally undertaken by a chartered fire engineer. So Gateway 2 will be a hard stop point where building control approval through the Building Safety Regulator should be obtained before building work actually starts. This is largely to prevent a build at your own risk approach. In Gateway 2, applications must also demonstrate how proposals comply with building safety requirements. So building regulation should be considered holistically now, and it's a more outcome-focused approach which will be required. And that includes consideration of building safety, and duty holders should consider compliance with the building regulations as not being a tick box exercise, which has always really been the case. And all plans and documents need to be realistic for the building and proportionate to the building, and not rely on unreasonable assumptions about the occupied building once built. So you need to consider things like management of the building, maintenance of the building, and the types of behaviours and characteristics of the residents using that building or other users and within the building. Information will be required on how duty holders will manage or meet their duties to have appropriate competency levels, maintain a digital golden thread of building information, which should be readily available for people who need that information, so duty holders who need that information, end users who need that information when they need it. And there'll be mandatory occurrence reporting requirements would have to be met also. And applicants will also have to demonstrate that they have appropriate strategies to deal with the construction phase in order to support building regulation compliance and reduce the possibility of building safety risks applying. So at Gateway 2, you will have to demonstrate a hell of a lot of forward planning for the construction phase and even onto the occupation phase of the building. A staged plans approach is available. Through this approach, building control approval will be strictly limited to the approved stages of work. Applicants will need to submit plans and documents for other stages of work, obtaining building control approval to proceed before commencing work on other stages. And the building safety regulator will have strong enforcement tools, or is proposed to have strong enforcement tools, where building work commences without first obtaining building control approval. So Gateway 2 is a definitive hard stop before construction. And between Gateway 2 and 3, and obviously the construction phase, all duty holders will be required to cooperate, coordinate, communicate, demonstrate appropriate competence during design and construction. The objective being to produce high quality buildings. And there may be a statutory change, there may be statutory change management requirements imposed. And this is obviously to ensure that the impact of proposed changes is thoroughly considered, proportionate regulatory oversight. The approach to categorising major and notifiable changes will be set out in secondary regulation, and this is subject to the consultations I previously spoke about. Once the bill, now the bill has gained royal assent. So major changes will require building control approval before they can be made. What are major changes are subject to the results of the consultations that are being undertaken, and serious designs could amount to a hard stop. So significant changes will have to be go through the approvals process, and this might be this could in worst cases put a halt to construction. But hopefully that doesn't happen and change is managed appropriately through the construction phase. And we'll be obliged now to maintain a digital golden thread, which can be handed over at the end to the end user at Gateway 3. And finally, duty holders will be under an obligation to report fire and structural safety occurrences, including all near misses, in line with their mandatory occurrence reporting duties. So finally, Gateway 3, this will be another hard stop where building control approval must be obtained from the building safety regulator before commencing occupation of high-risk buildings. And registration of the building and certification will be required. Gateway 3 applications must demonstrate how the building work complies with building regulation requirements to provide assurance that buildings are safe to occupy. Basically, to put it very simply, have you built the building you were given permission to build at Gateway 2? That's the simple question that the building safety regulator will be asking. The application will need to include plans, documents that reflect the as-built building, and this will form part of the digital golden thread of building information. The information must also be handed over to the end user, building owner, and this will help them manage building safety risks when the building is in use, by ensuring they have accurate, good quality and up-to-date information on the building. This approach is meant to deliver a culture change as building regulations compliance and building safety is considered throughout the design and construction phase, rather late in the process when mitigation measures may be needed. And the information must also be handed over, partial completion with a series of stock goal points will also be possible. Completion certificates will be issued if a Gateway 3 application is approved. And only once Gateway 3 has been passed, either for partial or full completion, can the new building be registered with the building safety regulator and be occupied. It will be an offence under the new Building Safety Act to occupy a higher risk building that has not been registered or certified. So registration's a separate process to the Gateway 3 approval. And once again, the Building Safety Regulator will have strong enforcement powers to deal with breaches of building regulations. So just a simplistic diagram. The Building Safety Regulator will impact design, construction and occupation. There'll be hard stops at Gateway 2 and Gateway 3. Gateway 2 is a hard stop where permission is needed to commence construction. During construction, significant design change could create a hard stop situation. And at Gateway 3, the Building Safety Regulator requires to be satisfied that the building is that which was given permission to be built. And then finally, in occupation of the Building Safety Regulator is satisfied that the building meets the required structural and fire safety requirements. Only then can the building be occupied. Finally, we've got to consider the digital golden thread, which will be required from design to demolition. So we need to consider how we're doing that, but that's a discussion for another day. So just to finish the presentation, a slight summary and discussion. So this is the most significant role, reform of building safety in a generation. And it's important that us as an industry response to the consultations that are underway. We need to make sure that the second regulation is proportionate and workable. But some concerns have already been raised. For instance, where there's no direction from government on a templated format for hard stop approval at gateways 2 and 3. Will this risk the Building Safety Regulator's office becoming a significant bottleneck, delaying projects? So timescales for the approvals process needs to be decided. So what's acceptable to industry? So this is another reason why we should get involved in the consultations that are underway. And finally, should more building types be included in the high risk category? What about residential low-rise? Should those be included? These are the types of things that are up for grabs, and types of information that government are keen to hear from the consultations. So we really hope that you get involved. So hopefully you enjoyed the presentation. Apologies, the presentation is obviously about regulation, and that can be a very dry subject. But hopefully there were some parts of the presentation that you found to be of interest. So thank you for listening, and we will welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I don't like to contradict a speaker, but when you said that was rather dry, I think it was fascinating and important. We're getting questions coming in. If you have more questions, either about Kevin's presentation or obviously when you listen to the next two, do please send them in. And as I said, we'll have as much of a discussion as we can. We just got time for a couple of quick questions now. I mean, one of them is that obviously the changes that you describe are very much needed. But do you think that the building safety regulator will be able to find enough skilled people to employ to actually do the work that's wanted?
Yeah, this is a fundamental question, and it's one that the Health and Safety Executive and the Building Safety Regulator needs to address quite quickly. The Health and Safety Executive, who is housing the Building Safety Regulator, has to give industry confidence that they can provide resource with the necessary competency and experience, and that's to ensure that the approvals process works efficiently. There are massive fears, as I said in my presentation, significant concerns that the approvals process will become a bottleneck in delaying the smooth running or the smooth handover of projects from one, for instance, from the design stage through to the construction phase. So finding competent resource, whilst it's an industry-wide problem, I think the Building Safety Regulator could look to existing building control officers and improved inspectors to join the Building Safety Regulator's office. But yes, it is quite a concern at the minute.
And our other question is about design and build. How will the process of the digital golden thread work with design and build, and particularly on projects where the original architect is not novated to the project?
Well, that's another really good question, and it's one that we all need to answer, not just the Building Safety Regulator. The single source of truth, the golden thread should be a single source of truth which is accessible to the right person at the right time. And this, as I said in my presentation, has to be maintained from the design of the building through to the demolition of the building. So it's a great concern when we're at Gateway 3. The handover process will create issues for developers, principal designers, principal contractors at Gateway 2. For one would imagine that there would be a significant due diligence exercise undertaken, and what evidence has been gathered to that point, to the Gateway 2 point, and what evidence would be required for a new incumbent, for instance, an architect, to take the project forward. The Building Standards Institute has released BS 8644, but that's been released to significant criticism in some quarters, as it doesn't outline a standard industry practice. In the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, it's not specified a means or a system to maintain the golden thread, but one would have imagined that BIM principles outlined in BS 19650 would be best suited to delivering the golden thread. But there will be an element of self-governance and providing guidance on specific means of delivering it. So, yeah, there would be a massive amount, but I think there's going to be a situation where we learn as we go. But yeah, it's a good question, because there will be concerns for any incumbent taking on a project through construction phase.
I know there are a lot of people coming through with questions for you. And as I said, everyone still has the chance to ask more. I'm glad that we will be able to address some more of these at the end during our discussion period. But now we are moving on to our second speaker, who is Sarah Susman, who is Head of Technical Development at Scott Brownrigg. Sarah.
Hello everyone. I'm Sarah Susman and I'm Head of Technical Development at Scott Brownrigg. I have been a practicing architect for over 20 years, and with the developing legislation over the years, have specialised in supporting the delivery of the CDM Regulations 2015, and in particular the Principal Designer role. For background, Scott Brownrigg are an architectural company of around 180 staff with offices and projects both in the UK and overseas, working with a diverse portfolio of sectors. I take part in a number of industry working groups regarding fire, life safety and CDM, and leading our implementation of the Building Safety Act and, of course, our established CDM delivery. There are huge implications for change for all of those who work in the built environment industry with the new Building Safety Act. How this is going to be done is still subject to change and further development, as the secondary legislation and the guidance is still being issued. But what it is going to mean is wholesale change to the way all the buildings are going to be designed, procured and managed to ensure the safety of those who live and work in them. The Building Safety Act came into law in April this year, and it was the response to Dame Judith Hackett's report, Building a Safer Future, the independent review of building regulations and fire safety, and it was published in 2018. And it identified the issues that contributed to the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017. And what was particularly identified overall was a wholesale failure of the building sector regulatory regime. For the construction industry, this will mean changes to procurement, design and construction processes, to accountability, funding and competency of all parties. The aim is to have greater accountability and responsibility for fire and structural safety issues throughout the life cycle of all buildings. And it's going to require a new regulatory regime for them, with even more stringent building control requirements for higher risk buildings. The definition for high risk buildings is now being defined within the higher risk buildings regulations, and that is out for consultation at the moment. The critical driver is the instituting of culture change and motivating compliance with regulations in the construction industry. And this is to address those significant failings found by Dame Judith in her report. This infogram here from CIBSE makes clear the parts that are applicable to all buildings and then those that are only for higher risk buildings. What people haven't always been clear about is that the changes to the regulations are to all building types, not just to higher risk buildings. The building safety reforms introduce a new regulatory framework for high-rise buildings. These include the creation of the Building Safety Regulator to become the Building Control Authority for high-rise buildings, the hard stop decision points during design and construction, the reduction of fire and safety risks related to fire spread and structural failure through greater planning and regulatory scrutiny, increased regulation of professional competence, which includes the building control inspectors and the building control authorities, introduce competency standards for all construction professionals for all construction projects, and this is through their professional and trade organisations. There are going to be new statutory roles during the design and construction of all building types. There's going to be a new statutory management role for the building owner during occupation. This has previously been discussed as being the building safety manager, but this title and role has now been removed, leaving only the management requirements. There's going to be a requirement for the golden thread of building information for higher risk buildings, but the principles of this are good practice and they could lead to better best practice for other building types as well. And there's going to be registers of building inspectors and building control approvers for higher risk buildings. And the new building safety regulator is going to be the Building Control Authority for higher risk buildings. To have more transparency of fire and structural safety strategies, the new regulatory regime for HRBs is being introduced. And these regulations will require the building owners to demonstrate safety, both structural and fire, at each of 3 new gateway points: for planning and design, for structure, for construction, and for occupation of the HRBs. At Planning Gateway 1, a fire statement is going to be required. This is going to be, and is actually already, an online application with defined questions, which includes the number of words required for responses. It has to be submitted by a fire engineer. Now, this is currently in place through the town planning process. Now, the building control application was previously known as Gateway 2, and the building safety regulator is given 12 weeks to make this approval. And they are asking that 2 weeks prior to the approval being made, that they are notified so that they can put a team in place to start the consultations. And this is going to be the equivalent of the old full plans application and will be taking place at the end of RIBA stage 4. And the building safety regulator is setting out what sort of plans, drawings and new prescribed documents they are going to want to see with that planning application, with that building control application. It is going to be quite different from what has been done before. If that has been agreed and approved in those 12 weeks, they will agree with you, with the contractor, an improved inspection schedule. But however, it doesn't remove the point that they will be able to come to site without agreed times to make on-the-spot inspections. It is also understood that during those stages, as you're coming to the end of construction, major changes are going to happen and take place. But what they are defining is the difference between a major change and a notifiable change. Now, a major change is to do with dealing with anything to do with fire and life safety. And they are defining that very clearly within their documentation. And they need to be given 6 weeks to determine that. And you are not allowed to start work until that has been approved. Notifiable changes are smaller, but they are changes. And they have to be submitted only for 10 days for consideration by the building safety regulator. If you don't hear from the building safety regulator, it is considered to be deemed to be accepted. A notifiable change will be one that does not affect the overall fire and life safety of that building. And at the end of Gateway 3, there will be a completion certificate application. So the compliance with these new regulations will be monitored by the newly established BSR, who are going to be part of the HSE, and they will have significant powers to demand documents and to stop works. They're going to make consultations with their internal multidisciplinary teams and with the fire and rescue services, and they carry out this role in conjunction with the planning authorities at the start of the process when you submit your fire statement as part of your planning documentation. And what needs to be clear for HRB developers, that they will not be able to choose their own building control body. Their body is now the building safety regulator. So the government would like to see that the principal designer appointed for CDM and the principal designer appointed for the Building Safety Act are one and the same, giving the duty holders clear accountability and statutory responsibilities as buildings are designed, built, refurbished and occupied. As CDM is embedded within the construction industry already and has driven change in relation to compliance with the health and safety requirements, it was felt safe and sensible to build on this knowledge and known structure. So the duty holders will keep their existing duties under the CDM regulations, but will also have requirements to make sure that the building regulations are complied with under this legislation. It will require 2 separate appointments in your roles. And that includes, of course, cooperating with all the other duty holders, communicating and sharing information, coordinating and putting systems in place to plan and manage work, and ensuring competence, which is appointing people with the right skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours for the work that they need to do. And you will see from this that there's very similar language used in the CDM regulations. So the duty holder for ensuring that the design is compliant with the building regulations is the principal designer. And that principal designer appointed has to be in control of all the design work, and it is understood that that would be the lead designer of the project. They need to plan, manage and monitor that design work, ensuring that the design, if built, will comply with all the building regulations. And they have to ensure that they and the designers in the team cooperate and communicate and coordinate their work with all the other duty holders. And they will liaise with the principal contractor when they're appointed and share all that information relevant to the building work so the contractor can build it safely. Now, every project is going to have a designated individual for that principal designer role if this role is appointed to an organisation. And it is expected that this role will be given to an organisation because it is so wide-ranging. But one person within that organisation will be the contact person for these regulations, the CDM Building Safety Act. So these new liabilities and technical challenges are going to require architects and design leaders to upskill themselves, to be certified and develop the right competencies. So, technical competencies. The government have worked with the BSI to produce PAS standards for competence frameworks for principal designers, principal contractors, and for the management of safety in residential buildings. For us on the design and construction side, we need to be cognizant of the principal designers and the principal contractors. This Act places a duty of competence on anyone carrying out design or building work to have the relevant skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours for that role. So what's happening at the moment is that the professional institutes and trade organisations are now working to produce outcomes-based training and skills requirements to map to the requirements of these PASs. So, project management, the RIBA plan of work. Now, generally, we have always been working to the RIBA plan of work 2020. A new one was released quite recently. And the fire strategy and the health and safety strategies are already included in the timeline of activities. However, going forward, we will need to map this onto the design and submission requirements from the Building Safety Act. And managing the mapping and management of the safety and fire risks onto this plan of work. And this is for all buildings and not just for HRBs. And we will need to make sure that the fire engineer is appointed early enough in the process to collate and submit the fire statement for planning. And this, of course, is allowing for the integration of the fire safety requirements and the strategy into the planning documentation. And the planning departments then consult with the building safety regulator for that particular statement. You are not allowed to deviate from that strategy while you progress during the workings that you're doing for Gateway 2. So the golden thread of information. This is material applicable to the building for all its activities, for all its construction, to be of building information to be identified, stored and updated throughout the building's life cycle. And this golden thread of information is going to require very clear lines of responsibility that will need to be drawn up. And surprisingly, the government have actually produced ideas about how this is going to be done. And they would like responsibility matrices for the design stage, for the design team, for the delivery stage by the contractor, and for occupation by the building owner. There's a considerable level of detail within the Building Safety Act and the new regulations and guidances coming out that we're going to need to be aware of. And again, they are talking about communication and coordination to do with design risk management and design project management. And also, that's being required are records being kept of all the products specified and constructed on your building. Now, all products are now going to have to be certified for construction use by the new Construction Products Regulator. If they haven't got that certification, we're not allowed to use it on the building going forward. Fire safety documentation. There is a lot of it. please make sure that you have all your documentation in order. So Regulation 38 of ADB, fire safety information is to be given to the responsible person. That already exists. However, there's going to be a requirement for the fire and emergency file for the higher risk buildings. And these are also, this fire and emergency file is also part of your Gateway 2 application. Because of this particular requirement for higher risk buildings, Regulation 38 no longer applies to higher risk buildings. Of course, already we have the requirement to provide the health and safety file to the client or the accountable person at the end of the project. And that obviously includes currently the fire safety strategy. I just wanted to touch on what the occupier has to do for the building. And they have to produce, for a higher risk building only, a building safety risk assessment, a safety case, and a safety case report. They will need to set out the fire and structural safety information and put it all together to register their building with the building safety regulator, likely in April in 2023. Once they have all that information together in that safety case report, they issue it to the building safety regulator, who then identifies the building's major fire and structural hazard and identify how the hazards identified are being managed and controlled. And this is to reassure the occupiers and residents of those higher risk buildings of what the fire safety measures are for their occupation. So this is the safety case report. And this includes the building's major fire and structural hazards and how they are being identified. And this report includes building information such as the building construction, facade material, insulation material, wall attachment type, roofing, compartmentation, means of access and escape, etc. The resident profile, fire prevention and protective measures, structural safety, services and utilities, and maintenance and inspection. As you can see, all that material they will be getting from our golden thread of information that we have provided through the design and construction process. So what does it mean for us in design and construction? Well, it's going to be an improved way of working. There's going to be communication and coordination. The golden thread would be the overarching wording that you would apply to that. There are going to be new single points of responsibility that have now been defined as new roles new roles for delivering building safety. There's going to have to be a change in organisation and industry attitudes to do with design team appointments, possibly procurement methods, and definitely to do with change control. Competency. It's going to have to be clearer and proved to the client at the beginning of the project as to you've got the right people to do the right work at the right time. Lots more training and learning. It's going to take a couple of years for us to bed in the new requirements from these regulations as more information becomes available. Record keeping. Basically, some really good filing, whether it's digital, whether it's online, whether it's web-based, whether it's cloud-based. Record keeping by every person as part of this process is going to need to be upskilled. And of course, part of that will be also to do with project management. And so basically, I think as a one-liner, basically, the Building Safety Act is going to be legislating the process of designing, procuring, building, and managing your building. Thank you very much.
That was a really interesting and eye-opening presentation, Sarah. We have time now for a couple of questions. Is this only relevant to high-risk buildings? And I know that you said at one point that these changes are going to affect all buildings. Can you just tell us a little bit about which elements of them will be relevant to non-high risk buildings?
Yeah, so there's been obviously a lot of focus on HRBs and what the difference is going to be on that, naturally because of Grenfell. So what is going to change for the whole system, of course, and for everybody, is identifying that actually the gateway system and the golden thread are not applicable to all other buildings outside that classification. They are only part of the regulations that are for higher risk buildings only. What it does apply to for all buildings, though, is remembering that the application of duty holders is for all buildings. It's not just for higher risk buildings. Of course, people will be familiar with that sort of setup because that's come through from the CDM regulations, which Dame Judith had a lot of regard for. The other interesting point is that non-HRB clients will be able to choose their building control organisation, which of course everybody can do at the moment. Going forward though, HRB clients will only be able to use the services of the building safety regulator. That choice won't be there, but other clients will be able to choose their building control organisation. And just to let people know and remind them that building control and approved inspectors are going to have competence assessments and be licensed and included on a register held by the building safety regulator. And only those organisations who are on that register will be able to be appointed for a project. What wasn't included, as I said before, was the golden thread of information for non-HRBs. However, there is much good practice that can be learnt from the golden thread principles, and they could be usefully applied to all other buildings in the spirit of the legislation, which is to do also with good communication and coordination regarding delivering buildings.
The other thing I wanted to ask you is about the practicalities. And you obviously have a great deal of specialist knowledge personally, and you're working in a large practice. I wonder how you think smaller practices are going to get to grips with these things. They're not going to be able to employ anybody equivalent to you, and especially if they're working on their first project of this type.
It is going to be difficult for people, and some people have said there are possibly going to be sort of two-tier design organisations, those who can deliver HRBs and those who will not be classified and recognised to deliver those, because there are going to be additional competencies required for that. However, regarding good practice, always, even at the moment, if you are working on a different type of building typology, you would try and seek out external advice within the business. And however, as much as you can learn from other people, when a competency asks for skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours, gaining that experience can be a challenge. But it could mean, for the smaller practices, where it is the first time that you're working for an HRB, look at the experience of all the staff within your studio, and also think about partnering up with another practice in order to help deliver that as a whole. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there that could work quite successfully with that. But it is going to be about gaining experience and practice with other people and gaining that knowledge outside of your business when it is your first time doing that.
Thank you for those answers. I am now delighted to introduce our third speaker, who is Andrea White, fire engineer with AW Fire.
All right, well, good morning to everyone. I'm Andrea White and I'm a fire engineer working at incorporated engineer level. I've worked in the fire safety industry now for about 22 years, including 5 years working in fire safety enforcement for a county fire service and also training as a retained firefighter. I spent another 5 years working also for a well-known rural insurer. I'm a chartered health and safety professional, and I actually began my career managing buildings, which gives me a really good understanding of some of the issues associated with that. I've got a master's degree and an HND in fire engineering, and my first degree focused mainly on timber and wood science. So I've got a particular interest in fire in combustible structures. Currently, I split my time. I have my own fire safety consultancy, W Fire Ltd, and that supports designers and developers. But I also assess external walls and sign EWS1 forms, as well as carrying out expert witness work for the courts in relation to fire safety and external walls. So that's a bit about me. And today I thought I'd give you my perspective as a fire engineer who assesses external walls on that subject and shape my talk around the theme today of safety first. Okay, so I'm sure that everyone watching is aware of Building Regulation B4, which relates to external fire spread and the design of new buildings or new parts of buildings. Regulation B4.1 requires that the external walls of the building shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another, having regard to the height, use and position of the building. Now, approved document B gives us a little bit more information. It says that the external walls of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread if that is likely to be a risk to health and safety. But there are now a number of other aspects that I want to consider. Firstly, we have fire safety legislation for occupied buildings, and that's in the form of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. That requires that the responsible person undertakes a suitable and sufficient risk assessment in relation to fire and life safety. Now, earlier this year, the Fire Safety Act was enacted, and that clarified that the building structure and its external walls need to be considered as part of that fire risk assessment. It also spelt out that attachments to external walls, so things like solar PV panels, brise soleil, balconies, they also need to be considered as part of that fire risk assessment. Now, this brings some challenges to the fire risk assessment industry that I've been part of for nearly 2 decades, because most fire risk assessors are not competent to assess construction materials that make up the building. Construction materials and methodologies is a subject that hasn't really formed part of most fire risk assessment courses for roughly the last 20 years. There are also some real difficulties for fire safety professionals being able to get insurance to assess external walls, which I'm sure architects are well aware of. So it's likely that these aspects will have to form a separate annex to the fire risk assessment and will be done by a relatively small number of firms and individuals. Separately to fire safety legislation, we also have mortgage lenders who are looking for reassurances around external walls from a risk perspective. And from that standpoint, the RICS devised the EWS1 form. Now, this rates the primary materials used in the external walls of a residential block of flats as either being of limited combustibility or not of limited combustibility. And then there's a subset rating as to whether works are required or remediation works are not required. Now, those signing those EWS1 forms have to have specific qualifications and memberships that are stipulated. And I'm told that there are around 100 of us signing those forms at the moment, which obviously is not a huge number. For someone looking for a mortgage on one of those flats, these forms still largely remain a requirement, and different lenders have differing stances depending on the rating given on the form. Only limited lenders will lend on a B2 rating, for example, and a B2 relates to buildings where there is combustible materials in the external walls and remedial works have been deemed to be required based on the findings of that external wall assessment. Now, earlier this year in April, the Building Safety Act received royal assent, and the bulk of the new obligations under that Act will come into force within the next year or 18 months. I thought for this presentation, I'd just pick out a couple of aspects of the Act which are relevant to external walls. Now, one aspect is that the Building Safety Act will now allow increased access to redress through the Defective Premises Act and Section 38 of the Building Act. And that's actually been in place now since the 28th of June 2022. It will also widen the scope of the 72 Act and bring into force Section 38, which gives private individuals the right to bring a claim for compensation for physical damage as a consequence of a breach of a duty imposed by building regulations. Now, the Act will also extend limitation periods for claims. Those relating to a dwelling, it'll extend from 6 to 15 years, except for claims arising prior to the commencement of the Act, and those will have a limitation period of 30 years. So there's some really quite substantial changes that have been brought in as a result of the Building Safety Act being enacted. Now, in terms of civil litigation around external walls, this is a very recent court case, and the finding was that a specialist housing contractor, Malali, had breached its contract in both its specification of cladding and its installation of that system, which was found to be defective. Now, the potential bill is over £8 million in damages for both the remedial works undertaken to fix the defects and also the cost of the waking watch implemented as an interim measure. So we can see that this case could potentially have huge ramifications over who pays to rectify cladding, which is deemed to be faulty. And it really highlights the extent of the potential claims, the size of potential claims. So I've tried to show there that there's been a substantial increase in the mechanisms through which external walls need to be considered, and also the ways in which redress can be sought. What I want to do now is briefly look at how we assess external walls. And PAS 9980 is a new guidance document that was recently published. It gives professionals a methodology to use when assessing external walls. And it uses 3 risk factors which are considered as part of that assessment. Firstly, fire performance. So that looks at what materials make up the external walls, how combustible they are, and what about the presence and standard of cavity barriers. The second risk factor is facade configuration. So how are the materials set out across those external walls? Are there small sections of combustible cladding amongst large areas of non-combustible materials, for example? Is the insulation combustible or non-combustible? Do we have stacked balconies running up the building, or are they set out far apart from each other and disparate? And then the third risk factor is fire strategy and fire hazards. So what is access like to the building? Can you firefight on all elevations of the building? Or is it perhaps built along a canal or a river, for example? Is there a car park underneath the building? This risk factor covers a number of associated aspects which are likely to affect ignition sources and affect firefighting. Now, I thought I'd use the rest of my time to give a couple of real life examples of these 3 risk factors and some of the issues that I've encountered. So my first example is about cavity barriers at compartment boundaries in a block of flats. You can see from the image on the left here, we have some open state horizontal cavity barriers and a full fill vertical cavity barrier. Now, unfortunately, the designers of the cladding on the building on the right image, they weren't aware that vertical cavity barriers need to be full fill. There's no tested solution for the use of open state cavity barriers in a vertical orientation. So these were deemed to be incorrectly installed. Now, even worse, when I saw this photograph, it was actually several weeks after it had been taken, and at that point, the cladding had all been completed. This building had been very carefully clad with non-combustible materials throughout the external wall, so that an A rating could be achieved on an EWS1 form. But because open state cavity barriers had been specified vertically, it was only given a B1 rating. And as I said earlier, that affected the lending market for leaseholders of flats in that block. Now, my second example is about the importance of providing drawing details for all cavity barriers, including those around penetrations such as windows, doors, and service ductwork. So here on the right, this is a vent duct through a timber frame wall with combustible insulation. There's no cavity barrier around the vent duct, which should have a cavity barrier of EI 3030. Now, no detailed drawings have been supplied to stipulate cavity barriers on this build. I gave this block a B2 rating on an EWS1 form, which meant that remedial works had to be undertaken and cavity barriers had to be installed around all of the service ductwork penetrating the external timber frame walls. Now, my third example is this block of flats with balconies and with barbecues on about half of the balconies on the block. The building has a great outlook, and I fully understand why people would want to sit on their balcony, enjoy the view, and have a barbecue. However, if you have a look at the top of the patio windows in this photograph, they're slightly recessed into the cladding, And I'll now show you a photograph taken from inside the wall cavity. So this photograph was taken using a borescope. The perforated metal on the left of the photograph is the horizontal overhang above the patio windows. It's installed to prevent insects getting into the wall cavity, but from a fire perspective, any fire venting out of those patio windows now has direct access via this perforated metal mesh to the combustible insulation in the wall makeup, irrespective of any cavity barriers around the window itself. This building received a B2 rating on its EWS1 form, and remedial works were required. Now, finally, here are 2 blocks of flats in the red rectangle, and I've shown the access road to those flats with a red arrow. The access road is off a residential road. Now, the access road, the small road to the flats, had planters added on either side and ended up not being wide enough for a fire engine. It was narrower than the 3.7 metres set out in approved document B. Now, what I wanted to show you is a modern fire appliance. So modern fire engines now stow equipment on shelves that come out sideways, and that substantially increases the width needed to access equipment in the location where the engine is parked. So actually, the figure stated in approved document B now needs to consider a much wider width where the fire engines are parked. So in conclusion, the theme of today is safety first. And from my perspective as a fire engineer, I think we need to build safer by building together, by involving relevant professionals during early design stages. We've now got requirements for gateways for relevant buildings and for fire statements, which support this early intervention and wider involvement of professionals at earlier REBA stages, and I support that fully. I hope I've shown you the importance of having drawing details of aspects such as fire stopping and cavity barriers. And my hope is that passive fire protection providers and fire engineers will have greater involvement during those early REBA stages. I'd also like to see them brought in during construction to scrutinise changes to the build and to scrutinise workmanship during construction. For external walls, a lot of fire safety aspects just aren't visible in the completed building. And my view is that we need to make sure those are right during construction. Finally, I'd urge you to think about the spirit of the regulations rather than just perhaps the letter of the approved document. For example, if you can't get a fire engine near, it's going to be difficult for firefighters to fight a fire there. I think bringing in another pair of eyes, be that a consultant fire engineer or a regulatory body such as the fire service, might ensure that we build buildings which are more resilient and easier to fight fire in. There's going to be a Q&A session later, and I'll be happy to take questions then, or you're welcome to email me or get in contact via LinkedIn. Thanks very much for listening.
Well, there's a Q&A session now. One thing that did occur to me, and I don't think I'm even asking you to answer this, is when you see those elements in buildings which were not completed properly, and then people went on and finished the building, it did occur to me that if we hadn't seen those photographs, if you hadn't seen those photographs, you'd never have known what was wrong. But a couple of other things to discuss. One is picking up on you saying that you were working with timber in the early part of your career. What impact do you think the legislation will have on the use of timber structurally and or for cladding?
Okay, well, Ruth, I think we're probably now in a place where external walls of buildings and the way they've been constructed is becoming more scrutinised, aren't we? We're starting to identify some really significant problems, both with cladding and with structural protection of timber structures. I suspect that the increased access to redress that I mentioned and the extension of limitation periods that might encourage designers to really carefully consider whether timber is the right structural material, particularly for blocks of flats where there's a stay-put evacuation strategy. I think in the last few decades, perhaps we've taken a very prescriptive approach to applying ADB rather than focusing on the functional requirements. We do need to remember that ADB wasn't written for modern methods of construction, and it states that it provides guidance for common building situations, as it puts it. I would actually question whether timber structures are common building situations in that context. And to that point, that there's actually a very useful lecture on YouTube by Dr. Angus Law. He's at Edinburgh University. It's really relevant to this topic, and it's called "We Need to Talk About Timber." So viewers, if they're interested in this subject, they might want to look at that. So it's called "We Need to Talk About Timber" by Dr. Angus Law.
Thank you. You also talked about the low numbers of people who are able to assess the materials in external walls, and that's both for getting approval for the building and also, as you said, for mortgage lenders. The word that immediately occurs to me when you say that is delays. Do you think I'm right?
I'm afraid I do. Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got a couple of issues that are causing those delays. One of them is competence, in terms of the numbers of buildings that we want to have looked at and the number of individuals who are competent to do that. I think that's a real sticking point. And then the other sticking point, even for those people who are competent, is access to insurance, PI insurance, particularly, for people who are operating small consultancies. That's a real challenge at the moment to get PI that doesn't exclude comment on external walls. I want to be positive, so I think there are actions being taken on both counts, but I certainly don't think there's going to be any quick fix for this.
Now, I am going to ask our other speakers to rejoin us so that we can have a group discussion and address some of the other questions that have come in from our audience. And we've had questions about this, the guidance for Gateway 2 and Gateway 3, and the fact that the government withdrew some of this, or withdrew all of it, I think, in July. So as far as I can see, despite the fact that everyone's trying to get themselves ready for enormous changes, it's quite difficult to understand what those changes are. That's my take, but I'm going to go to our experts who I'm sure can clarify this a great deal more for us. I'm going to go to Kevin.
Thanks, Ruth. Yes, whilst the gateways have been withdrawn, conceptually the gateway system will be made part of law in between 12 to 18 months' time. I think the reason why they're withdrawn is to allow proper consultation on how the gateway system will operate. Obviously, industry has its concerns, and this gives industry the opportunity to address those concerns and present those to the health and safety regulator, the health and safety executive, the building safety regulator, and government. So once those consultations have been undertaken, the main consultations close on the 12th of October this year. Then following that, I think the proper and more meaningful secondary regulations will be published early in the new year. So I think there's still time to effect some change and sort of mould into a palatable solution for industry.
And boring question, but does that mean they will no longer be called Gateway 2 and Gateway 3?
No, we've been, Hydrock Fire Safety, been involved in the roundtable discussions with government, Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. And those ongoing discussions, the Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 are still firmly established as how that process is going to be undertaken.
But they will be called that?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. You believe so, thank you. We've had a question, or a couple of questions, about whether or not one always needs a fire engineer and if an architect is experienced, can they, in certain cases, actually say that can they certify the fire strategy themselves? I'm going to put this to Andrea, and I think the questions have come in both in general, can the architect always do it? And secondly, are there any instances when the architect is good enough, which I'm guessing people are asking about non-high risk buildings. And as an add-on, someone said, I'm not sure what kind of projects the new process applies to. Is it only architectural processes that involve cladding, terraces, etc., or also Cat B fit outs? I think that's all in your field, Andrea.
Well, I can certainly try and answer the first question.
Yes.
I think that's an interesting one. I think I see more architects now looking to engage a fire engineer, even for relatively simple work, not least because building control are asking for fire engineer input, be that in a technical note or a fire strategy. I suppose the simple answer comes down to skills, knowledge, and experience. I know of architects who are very good fire engineers. So in that case, there would be nothing wrong with an engineer, an architect, doing fire strategy. What I would also say though is that architects have to look at a really wide range of aspects in order to do their job. Whereas for a fire engineer, they're really only specialising in one aspect, Reg B. And therefore, there are opportunities there to potentially make some savings or to reduce the amount of fire safety provisions. I've seen that in a number of situations where actually the fire safety provisions that are suggested by an architect are an over provision. And maybe someone with experience, particularly of a practical in building use background, can actually make that building easier to operate from a fire safety perspective. So I think there's real benefit in bringing in a fire engineer from that perspective. But I also think in the environment we're operating in now, it's a question that really comes down to skills, knowledge, and experience.
I've had people asking about the extra workload created, saying local planners seem overloaded already. Also concerned that this will add to cost and timescales, and eventually actually add to the cost of housing, which will be, which I guess if the cost of housing goes up, that means it actually adds to what people are paying either to buy housing or in terms of rent. Sarah, what's your view on this?
They're quite right. And the government guidance before it was withdrawn, there is an impact assessment to do with the additional costs that will be, which will be gained by the whole design team and by the client in order to carry out this. It is seen as being a drop-off. There's going to be high cost to start with. There's going to be a lot of learning to start with, and there's definitely going to be increased costs in producing all this, timescales, everything, appointments of consultants, that will all affect it. With it bedding in, it will drop off some of that to some extent, but without question, I would have thought it is most definitely going to elongate the process, and there are going to be additional costs involved. And if you sort of drill down into that and look at the really, really big picture, you get right to the point of, yes, it's going to increase the cost of housing. It could do something to the cost of land in the first instance. It could be, in the long term, quite a big change.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say not necessarily about cost, but about capacity. I just thought this might be a good point to sort of give a bit of a tip. I suspect that around half of the phone calls or the inquiries that I get for work involve the question of how quickly can you do this? And, if you can't do it in the next 4 weeks, I can't use you. I need to find someone in the next 4 weeks. And actually, what I would say is, most fire engineers are booked up several months in advance, if not longer. So, to say, if you're thinking you might need a fire engineer, my tip would be, you don't have to necessarily engage them, but at least, flag up with them that you're looking for some assistance, just so that they can have you on their radar, and that they can pencil in some time in their diary potentially. Or, it's frustrating from our side to know that we can't make space in our diary in the next 2 weeks. There's too much demand for that. So really what I suppose I'm saying is, if people can plan ahead and just, potentially engage with a fire engineer, and tentatively make those inquiries sooner rather than later, it's much easier for me to abandon some proposed work or shift it further down the diary than it is to create space in my diary.
Do we have enough fire engineers?
I think it's a similar problem to what Sarah was saying. It's a no. Sorry, Kevin.
Sorry, Andrea, I didn't mean to overstep, but I think the simple answer to that is no. At Hydrock, we have to grow our own talent internally. So luckily, we're supported by a very forward-thinking board of directors who allow us to create fire engineers from other disciplines. For instance, we take graduates from other disciplines and we create fire engineers over a 3 to 5 year period. There aren't enough fire engineers in the business, and we're at a very peculiar time when we have universities basically closing down fire engineering courses, which I find very peculiar. Certainly, when the industry has never been in greater need of fire engineers, so we have a massive problem there to address, definitely.
And of course, like you say, you can't address it immediately. You're saying it takes 3 to 5 years for you to convert them. I don't need to go back to Andrea to ask her, but I'm sure it took her a long time to train. We can't suddenly snap our fingers and have a load more. I kind of worry about building control as well. But on a different matter, when we talk about the golden thread and this concept of taking information all the way through the project, which of course is really important, how does it come out at the end? Because you're talking about residents, building users being able to understand this. Is it somewhere set out that it should be done in a way that somebody with non-specialist knowledge could actually understand the information that's produced?
There isn't a lot of information really about that at the moment. They have made in the consultation and the guidance quite clear that they weren't going to be prescriptive about it. It's a generic, to some extent, what one needs to see about the building and the building materials, and to be very careful that it's not about anything else to do with the building. It could be similar to what we bumped into with the CDM regulations and the health and safety file, containing information that wasn't relevant to that health and safety file. Whether it's always got to be digital, but it could be digitized material. It doesn't necessarily have to be a BIM model as such, and passing on that information. It will be the client who is going to have responsibility for providing the environment for keeping all that material in one place to be passed along through the different stages. What I myself am confused about are to do with the PASs, to do with the BIM PAS, I think it's 19650, and the requirements of the Building Safety Act, and how that, I'm not sure that they really join up terribly well. And I think more clarification on that needs to be developed in time. The government's sort of got something in mind, but it is not clear enough for me at the moment. Andrea, you're a bit clearer on this.
Are you?
Well, I was just going to say, it's quite interesting to me to listen to the discussion about golden thread, because for me it's just Reg 16B, which became Regulation 38, in another guise. I really don't see that it's fundamentally any different from what we've got in Regulation 38. So I agree. I've had a look at the British Standard on digitalisation, and I was very interested to see whether it required BIM, and it doesn't. So effectively, all it's saying at the moment is, as long as you've got PDFs of your documents, that's totally acceptable. And I do hear of organisations, for example, housing associations, that are going down this BIM model path, and I worry, because I think we've got to remember proportionality, and I think we have to look at how much effort are we putting in, and what are we getting out at the end of it, and actually how difficult is it going to be to keep this information current. Because the worst thing of all is to spend all the time in the world creating this information and then for it not to remain current, because at that point it's pointless. So my concern is that people put a huge amount of effort into some very complex forms of information, and then don't have the capacity or the competence to keep it current. And I think that would be a real travesty. I think what I'm really looking for is Regulation 38 to be implemented, and we'll just call it the golden thread.
That's really interesting. And I'm going to come to you now with a last question, which is specifically addressed to you, Andrea. And I'll ask you for a quick answer if you can, because we are running out of time. But somebody's saying, when conducting EWS1 form surveys, do you consider battery energy storage systems and electric vehicle charge points as fire hazards?
Oh, interesting question. So underground car parks are written up in PAS 9980 and solar PV. But the short answer to your question is absolutely. Where I've got combustible cladding, I will be saying, if you haven't got charging points there now, please don't be putting them in until we sort out this cladding. That's probably a very oversimplified answer, but I know you wanted a quick response, Ruth.
But we could talk about this for a great deal longer. But unfortunately, we are running out of time. I'm sure we'll come back to this again, particularly when we have more clarification. And obviously, the consultation periods are still open. So if you do have strong feelings, I'm sure Kevin would, in particular, would be urging you to send in your responses. But for now, we've come to the end of this. And I just really wanted to thank all our speakers, everyone who sent in questions, particularly our programme partner, Schu. Thank you all very much for watching, and we'll see you again.